And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and ask Fanon to introduce himself and go ahead and start. We're going to wait till after his presentation in order to address questions at that point. So, Fanon, it's
Well,
yours.
thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate the invitation and appreciate all of you all signing on. You know, this takes me back to 2020 when we were campaigning in COVID and all of our fundraisers and most of our events were online for the first time ever. So this is kind of reminiscent of 4 years ago. But I'm glad we have the option of being in person too. Um, I appreciate Bold New Democracy's work. Certainly, I'm no stranger here. As you all know, I ran for prosecutor first time back in 2004, and I had an awesome coordinator who's nodding his head there, and Brewster Rose. He was one of the folks who was very helpful on the campaign and kind of gave me an introduction into the political world. But it was a a deep dive into politics. Period. Obviously, I served as a judge for about 13 years when I retired back in 2019 and ran for prosecutor a second time in the rematch with me and that guy who's now regrettably on the Supreme Court. And so I've been a managing attorney with the Cochran Law Firm since I stepped down, where I advocate and represent people in all types of matters, mostly personal injury, some police misconduct and brutality, and civil rights cases as well. So we're here to talk about, in an abbreviated form, some aspects of Project 2025. And one of the advantages that I know I have in this discussion is that I'm speaking to a group that is extremely well informed and that is very aware and engaged in the political process. So some of what I'm going to give you is going to be less of the overview and more of the deep dive so that we can talk more deeply with our contacts about why this is a problem and to address the issues that people are talking about when they say, well, one, Project 2025 isn't relevant anymore because they've withdrawn it. They're not pushing it anymore. And really, why is it, or how is it compared to Agenda 47, which, as we know, is what the Republicans and what the former president are saying is their true agenda, and they don't know anything about Project 2025. And we'll compare it in the last portion of this conversation, and we'll see if there really is a distinction between some of the finer points of Project 2025 and Agenda 47. This is a conversation. Now I'm going to do a classroom. I teach at the law school. I've been teaching for a long time, and so this is going to be a classroom for the first, I believe, 40 minutes. Dan, is that right? And then
Uh, about
half hour.
35 for you is what we had said. Yeah.
Got you. And then really questions and deeper engagement in the last part of this. So to start off, I just want to offer to you a couple of quotes from Project 2025. And I have a few of them that I'll be using directly from the book. This is a quote. It is not enough for conservatives to win elections. If we're going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, we need both a governing agenda and the right people in place ready to carry this agenda out on day one of the next conservative administration. That's a quote directly from Project 2025. It's giving very clearly the intention of this policy manual. It is not enough for conservatives to win elections. If we're going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, and then it talks about some of those things that ultimately are the four pillars of Project 2025: the right people in place, carrying this agenda out, conservative administration. That's the center point of the understanding of what Project 2025 is. But who did it come from, and why does this thing even matter? Well, what you all know is that Project 2025 is a policy manual by the Heritage Foundation. And who is the Heritage Foundation? Again, I'm on a phone call with people who are deeply engaged. And so you are already know the Heritage Foundation is an activist conservative think tank that was started in 1973. And it had the goal of formulating and promoting public policies based on free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, and this is a quote, traditional American values. And that traditional American values phrase will be very relevant when we talk about some of the more eyebrow raising policies that are being pushed in this policy 2025. It was founded during the Nixon administration by three individuals, Paul Weyrich, Edwin Foldner, and Joseph Coors. I'm not going to go very deeply into those individuals' backgrounds, but I will offer to you that Paul Weyrich, one of the three founders, he is an American religious conservative political activist and the commentator who is associated with the concept of the new right. And we all are familiar with that organization. He's actually the person who's known for the phrase moral majority, and he co-founded that group with Jerry Falwell. This is one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation in 1973. He's one of the architects of the religious right. And let me just tell you, a lot of I consulted probably about 20 or 30 different sources in putting together this presentation and the presentations that I've been giving for the past month and a half. And so that information is not in Project 2025, but it is from the research that I've done on the background of the Heritage Foundation and again its founders and some of their biographies. But that's one of the founders. He gave a speech that I like to talk about in 1980, where he essentially says voting is not for everybody, and they're not encouraging everybody to vote. In fact, what he said is, I don't want everybody to vote. This is a quote from the founder of this political system, this political organization. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they're not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down. Wow, that was a public speech given by one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation. And why is that relevant? Well, when we talk about why this was founded and some of the policies that they're pushing here and over the years, to know what the objectives and what the positions of those who are the architects of this organization help to understand what their goals are. And so he is one of the founders saying, no, 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 we don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage is when fewer people vote. That's interesting considering they're a politically based organization or a foundation that's talking to voters. Or are they really talking to voters? Another founder is a guy named by the name of Edward Foldner. Really not much about him, but he talks about who their goals were, excuse me, who their targets were. Targets weren't actually voters. He said our target audience includes senators, congressmen and congresswomen, and key staff aides. Most people don't know this, but there are 35,000 congressional staffers on Capitol Hill. They pull together to their bosses on how they should vote on forthcoming bills. So they're even saying, this is one of the founders said, look, we're not worried as the Heritage Foundation about the individual voters. We're worried about the people who are passing the laws. Because in as much as this is a policy document, policies don't mean much if the individuals who are carrying forth those policies don't buy in. And so the Heritage Foundation's founders saying, look, that's our target. Not all these voters who are critical of our policies and things. We're focused on the people who are reading these bills and ultimately passing these bills. Because without the work and the cooperation from them, none of their policies actually go into effect. So that's the second founder. The third one, I'll just mention his name, Joseph Coors. Joseph Coors is the third founder, hard right political philosopher. He was a member of Ronald Reagan's kitchen cabinet. He helped fund Reagan as governor and president. There was a lot of stuff about the Coors Brewery and some boycotts by the AFL-CIO in 1977 that lasted for many years while he was the president. But he's the other founder of the Heritage Foundation. So those are the big three who founded this super conservative think tank in 1973. So that's the background of the Heritage Foundation. What is this Project 2025 thing? The official name is the Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. It is officially the 2025 Presidential Transition Project. Now, this one in particular was published in 2023, even though we just started talking about it in 2024. But it's relevant because the first mandate for leadership was published in 1981. Well, it was the 1981 mandate for leadership. And who, of course, had just gotten elected in 1981? Ronald Wilson Reagan, who was historically known as the most conservative modern day president that we have had. The first mandate for leadership was published while he went into office. And interestingly, he accepted and pushed forward 50% of that document's policies in the first year. So when we talk about the relevance of the Heritage Foundation, or we talk about the relevance of this mandate for leadership, it's just another policy manual, except when the first one came out, Ronald Reagan accepted and implemented 50% of the policies from that mandate. Trump, his first year in office, implemented 65% of the mandate in his first year. 65% from Trump of the mandate, 50% of it in Reagan. And so that's why we're talking about it. We're talking about it because it's not just, I mean, there are literally hundreds of thousands of think tanks and groups and parties and people interested in politics. But the Heritage Foundation has, because of its relationships, because of the positions that its founders and some of the authors of this particular manual having served in presidential administrations, the potential for the influence of the manual for leadership on the administration and on the policies of the president or the administration is huge. It's overwhelming. And historically, it has actually come to fruition. And so that's why we're talking about Project 2025. We're talking about it because historically, they've mattered. They've mattered because the presidential administrations that we know of have used them. Obama actually accepted some parts of it. Clinton accepted some parts of it when we talk about the capital gains taxes and some of the more conservative ideas about criminal justice that some people have been critical about with Clinton were in line with what the Mandate for Leadership and the Heritage Foundation were proposing. So we can expect that the next conservative president is going to accept 65% or greater of what they're proposing as policies if they get in. 922 pages, 30 chapters. The stated goal is to assemble an army of aligned, vetted, trained, and prepared conservatives to go to work on day one to deconstruct the administrative state. Again, those aren't Fanon Rucker's words. Those are words specifically from this 922-page document. The conservative promise represents the best effort of the conservative movement in 2023 and the next conservative president's last opportunity to save our republic. Whew, that's pretty aggressive. That's an aggressive position. But it should be more and more transparently clear why this is important to know and why it's important to talk to our constituents and friends about what it is that's being pushed in this document. I'm not going to go into the authors. Again, there are 30 chapters. There are hundreds of authors, hundreds of writers and contributors, but each chapter has at least one, sometimes two or three identified authors. at least 20 of those 30 identified authors were appointees in the previous Trump administration. 20 at least of the 30 identified authors of the current mandate for leadership were actually appointees in some capacity in Trump's administration. I mean, from the head of his Department of Health Services, Department of Human Resources, to the director of office management and budget under Trump. Um, I mean, all of them. And there was one that I will mention who was a little. The two of them are concerning. One is Christopher Miller. He was a Green Beret. He wrote Chapter 4, but he was the acting U.S. Secretary of Defense and was director of national counterterrorism under Trump. I would encourage you to Google his involvement in January 6th. It's a little bit unnerving. Another person that I would offer to you is Ken Cuccinelli, who you may or may not have heard of. He was the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security under Trump. While he was the Attorney General of Virginia, he was the first Attorney General in our country to file suit claiming Obamacare was unconstitutional and illegal. He wrote Chapter 6. The list goes on, but again, just trying to confirm for you that this is not accidental. And when they're disavowing any knowledge of it with the Trump administration or the Republicans saying this is radical and crazy and we don't have anything to do with it, the folks who wrote it are the people who were plugged in and who helped to drive the policies of the prior administration. So if there are outlandish ideas, or if there are concerning or scary or suggestions that prick the back of your neck, well, these are folks who are directly tied to the person who's currently running for president. And let me just say this. Project 2025, Heritage Foundation, as organization that they are not allowed to endorse any particular candidate. And this was written and published in 2023 before there was any certainty about who was going to be the Republican nominee. So this is truly not a Trump agenda. I mean, I will offer that. They're not saying, look, we're supporting Trump. Their goal is to support and to get elected a conservative president. It just so happens that currently the former president is the candidate who they're targeting now because he's the one who's endorsed and he is the one running as a Republican. So that's the mechanics of it. I'm looking at the time, and I just want to make sure we get to some of the interesting stuff. 4 pillars. There are 4 pillars to the Project 2025. 4 pillars. Number 1 is a domestic and foreign policy agenda. That's one pillar of this document, of this mandate, this policy document. The second pillar is a list of preferred personnel ready and willing to implement the policies of the next conservative president. A list of preferred personnel ready and willing. That's a pillar of Project 2025. The third pillar is an online educational system. It's called the Presidential Administration Academy. It's literally an online school that is required for those who intend to work in the administration. They have to take and pass this test. It's an online, some would say an indoctrination school, but it's an online educational system created by the Heritage Foundation called the Presidential Administration Academy. Third pillar. Fourth pillar, and this is the one that I guess deserves the most attention, and that is a 180-day playbook, first 6 months playbook to implement these policies that they propose in this mandate. Now, the pillars that we talked about, domestic and foreign policy agenda, an actual list of personnel, the online educational system, and a 180-day playbook. Those are the 4 pillars. And there's so much stuff underneath there, but that's what they identify as their 4 pillars. Now, in order to carry out the president's desires, they say political appointees must be given the tools, knowledge, and support to overcome the federal government's obstructionist human resources departments. More fundamentally, this is a quote from page 20. The new administration must fill its ranks with political appointees. How did they propose doing that? An executive order that would put political appointees into identified positions, as many as 54,000 loyalists around the country plugged in to positions. Now, what do we talk about? What are we talking about? Now, every time we see a presidential election, every time we see a gubernatorial election, even on a smaller scale, when we see mayoral elections, when a new administration comes in, they plug in as head of departments their political appointees as heads of departments. But the middle managers, the line workers, the everyday workers are non-political positions, and they carry out the daily work of the offices. What this is proposing very deliberately is saying, look, we need to get rid of all of those non-political positions and make every position in government, or the majority of positions, not just the titled department heads, but we need to make those who actually run the policies of the daily work of the position, work of the departments. Those need to be politically based appointments. The individuals who take those positions need to be aligned with and prepared to carry out the president's agenda at every level. And so they're talking about getting rid of the folks who say, "Look, I'm not about politics. I'm just here to do the work for the people that's needed." They said, "No, no, no, 54,000," and they're talking about creating that list of people to plug into all of those positions. And they're talking about an executive order that specifically would put that into place on day one. Some of the items, I got about 6 or 7 minutes to talk about these. Some of the things they talk about are proposing abolishing the Department of Education. We know that. Homeland Security, to abolish that. Abolishing the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. This has to do with a reflection of the resistance or the rejection of the idea that there is, in fact, climate change, and that they don't believe that education should be a federal issue, that it be turned back to the states. Now, I'm not going to go into a legal argument with you all about why states' rights over federal rights. We saw it in the 1800s when we were talking about slavery, and after slavery with the radical Reconstruction. We talked about states' rights as a battle in the 60s when the federal government had to send in federal troops in order to force governors who were opposed to integration, forcing them to allow young children to be escorted into schools by federal law. I mean, that's the fight between federal and state law. And these folks are saying no, states' rights should prevail over the power of the federal government. And that's one of the issues about getting rid of the Department of Education. What we also talk about, of course, is they propose completely rejecting transgender rights and gender identity, including banning transgender from serving in the military, prohibiting school educators from referring to students by anything other than birth name and pronouns without parental permission, and ensuring that no federal funds are used to provide gender-affirming care. With DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, no surprise, and LGBTQ, the policy proposes eliminating completely DEI programs in all aspects of government. And we see this happening now across the country in some states and universities. It actually, and this is interesting, Policy 2025 actually encourages the criminal prosecution of all state and local governments, institutions of higher education, corporations, and any private employers with DEI or affirmative action programs. Let me repeat that, because they also plan to dismantle the FBI and reposition the Department of Justice. But one of the things that actually encourages is the criminal prosecution. This is a quote: of all state and local governments, institutions of higher education, corporations, and any other private employers with DEI or affirmative action programs. Can you imagine actually criminally prosecuting institutions and colleges and businesses that have affirmative action programs? It advocates, the policy does, that the government maintain a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. It proposes, of course, an end to same sex marriage, removing protections on the basis of sexual or gender identity, and completely eliminating DEI, the words DEI, from any federal legislation and policies. It, of course, would take several steps to restrict abortion. One of the things that the policy says, look, we recognize that abortion is a kind of a flashpoint issue in our country. So we're not recommending that abortion be abolished or completely banned. However, they would completely defund Planned Parenthood, and they would direct the Federal Drug Administration to revoke approval of mifepristone, which is the pill that doctors prescribe in order to effect the termination of pregnancies. They even talk about prosecuting or using a very obscure, very old law to prosecute any entity that mails mifepristone as a violation of a federal law, sending something like that through the mail. So that's what they encourage in order to restrict abortion, because they say we don't want to ban it because everybody is going to have an argument and mess with Flashpoint. But let's look at all the ways we can stop abortion from happening in the country. Of course, it bars critical race theory from being taught in federally funded schools, and encourages legislation that would allow parents to sue schools that do teach critical race theory. They recommend changes to Title VII. I won't get into that very deeply, but Title VII involves discrimination in the workplace, and it requires the collection of certain data with regard to gender, race, and age. They say, look, we don't think those things are legitimate, so let's get rid of the requirement of keeping that data. As a lawyer, that means that those lawsuits will no longer be able to be brought. It recommends dismantling workers' rights through unions. Again, we talk about the founders, and this is not a surprise that this is the position that this policy manual is taking when you have founders who are anti-union, when you have founders who believe in and started the moral majority and religious right. I mean, this is the policies that flow from that seed that was planted by those individuals that founded the Heritage Foundation. One funny thing, and I know I'm running close on time, but one of the funny things, it proposes outlawing pornography. But the reason that it proposes outlawing pornography, because this is a quote, it is tied to the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children. That's the reason. Not that pornography is bad, and and what did Siley say? I don't know what it is. But whoever that was, the Supreme Court, that said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. But they're saying, no, all pornography is bad, any naked pictures and things like that, because it is tied to the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children. It actually calls for any librarian or educator who look at it to be registered as sex offenders. The government would no longer be able to investigate schools for signs of disparate impact of disciplinary measures based on race or ethnicity. It would eliminate Head Start and cut funding for free school meals. Student loan relief, of course, would be completely ended. In fact, one of the quotes that from the book says, the Biden administration has mercilessly pillaged the student loan portfolio for crass political purposes without regard to the needs of current taxpayers or future students. So they would get rid of the public service loan forgiveness program, and all efforts to eliminate student loans by these efforts. They would change the Department of Justice so that the FBI director, who's an independent body, would answer directly to the president. The FBI would no longer report to and be an independent law enforcement officer, but would answer directly to the president. It would require a total overhaul of the DOJ and the FBI. Why? To get rid of the radical left ideologues and focus more on violent crime and going after anti-white discrimination. That's what they would like to shift the focus. So they would shift their focus to focusing on violent crime, which I certainly agree with, but also focusing on prosecuting anti-white discrimination, because apparently that's a huge issue in our country. It encourages the enforcing the death penalty where appropriate and applicable. They say that the current crime wave justifies it. I'll just offer to you all before I talk about the comparison with Agenda 47 is that violent crime in this country has gone down for the past 10 years. In fact, it's looking to be at a historic low this year on a trend that's been going down literally if you look at the national crime statistics. But their position is you can't trust the statistics. So we believe that based on the news story, the crime is going up, and therefore it justifies the death penalty for this increasing and ridiculous crime wave we're all experiencing right now. What I'll also offer to you is that it talks about defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the nonprofit corp, of course, that provides funds for PBS and NPR. It proposes getting rid of the current tax rates. And there's a lot of talk about fixing our tax code. And I don't think anybody here believes that it should not. I mean, we think that it needs to be overhauled. But they propose two tax rates, 15% and 30%. A flat 15% tax rate for anyone who makes under $168,000 and a 30% tax rate for anybody that pays over, excuse me, that makes over 168. Now, the problem with that is that currently the lowest income earners don't pay a 15% tax rate. And they would then shoulder the biggest burden of an increased tax rate because they make the least amount of money. And so now they're paying a higher tax rate than they are right now, even though, again, they have the least amount of resources to handle what they have right now with the tax rate. So a flat 15% under 168,000 and a flat 30% over those who make for those who make over 168,000, which of course, as we know, was also a reduction in the tax rate for some very, very high earners, which their argument is that helps to promote business because the highest tax earners are the ones who actually put money into the economy. Therefore, them being able to keep some of their money would encourage free enterprise and more business and money coming in. Finally, and again, there's so much here, and I'm just trying to give you kind of just an overview. It proposes pulling the U.S. out of international organizations when they don't service the administration's interest, like the WHO, the World Health Organization, and of course, various UN agencies. Finally, it would make significant cuts to Medicaid and would impose work requirements to receive coverage in Medicaid. That's some of the more eyebrow-raising proposals. There are a lot more that 5 hours worth of time would not get you to. But I do want to just take the last 5 minutes and talk to you about the comparison with Agenda 47. What is Agenda 47? Well, according to the preamble, it's the 2024 GOP platform to make America great again. It is a forward-looking agenda that begins with 20 promises. Not going to go off on all the promises, but it's stuff like, I'll say this, the language of Agenda 47 distinguishes itself from Project 2025. Agenda 47 is a political platform, which it's okay. I mean, every political party should have a platform, but a platform is different than a roadmap. A platform is platitudes about what we're going to do and promises and pounding the table about what we believe are the big issues. Policy 2025 is a specific playbook, a roadmap about how to dismantle the entire system and incorporate some beliefs in the rebuilding of that system and how it operates. That's not what Agenda 47 is. Agenda 47 says stuff like seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. It's not a playbook. That's a rally cry. Agenda 47 says we're going to carry out the largest deportation in American history. That's an Agenda 47 piece. But it doesn't give the specifics about the executive order. about how it's going to be accomplished. It doesn't say how we're going to use the Department of Justice to prosecute. I mean, so the difference between Agenda 47 and Project 2025 is form over substance. It's it's talking versus how do we do what we're trying to do. Here's another one. Agenda 47 says we're going to end inflation and make America affordable again. What kind of crap is that? That's not a it's not a plan. It's a statement. We're going to end inflation and make affordable America affordable again. Here's a real specific one. We're going to defend our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a right to keep and bear arms. You see the difference between Project 2025 and Agenda 47? Project 2025 says we're going to look at the 30 chapters stand for the 30 departments that are under the administration's executive powers. And it says it identifies each of those 30 chapters is what needs to happen in each of those departments to specifically upend and restructure how the government works. Agenda 47, again, is political grandstanding. We're going to undo DI policies. Well, wait a minute. That's interesting. That's a political statement on Agenda 47, but I seem to remember that in Project 2025, their goal is to remove DEI, the words, from every piece of policy in the federal government and every piece of federal legislation. So when we talk about the disavowal or the lack of connection between them, Agenda 47 is saying what they're going to do. Project 2025 is telling how it's going to be done. We talk another one on Agenda 47. They're going to end the weaponization of government against the American people. One of the things when they talked about in Project 2025, they talk about going after liberal prosecutors for not enforcing the laws. They talk about using the DOJ to go after anti-white discrimination, but also they say that the Department of Justice has been used too often to prosecute individuals for protesting at abortion clinics and other things, and therefore it needs to be repositioned so that that's not their focus. And here we have in Agenda 47, we're going to end the weaponization of government against the American people. And we're going to defend freedom of speech and freedom of religion. That sounds a whole lot like the overarching conversation in Project 2025, even if they don't say specifically how they intend to do it. Keep men out of women's sports. We know what they're talking about there. Transgender athletes being able to compete. Pushing prayer in schools, seeking out and undoing Marxism in education, getting rid of the Department of Education in Project 2025, but Agenda 47 says we're going to seek out and undo Marxism in education. See, Agenda 47 is bombastic and fiery and intended to light up a base. Project 2025 is for the intellectual consideration of the people who are put into these positions about how they're going to carry out the fire for those that may not be a part of Agenda 47. On day one, Trump will sign an executive order to end automatic citizenship for children of illegal aliens. That's Agenda 47. He's going to deploy federal troops for law and order. That's Agenda 47. Facilitate the hiring of 100 U.S. attorneys to investigate what Trump believes to be left-leaning district attorneys and anti-conservative bias in law school and law firms. You see here the difference? Again, one is a specific roadmap of the restructuring of the government structure and the operation of the system. The other is just political platitudes and campaign promises. But you can clearly hear some overlap between what Project 2025 pushes and Agenda 47. So that's the time. I want to leave plenty of time for conversation or to help answer any questions. I'm not an expert on this thing. I don't work for the Heritage Foundation. I kind of fell into this Project 2025 stuff when a friend of mine asked me to come on her podcast. And so I've been deep diving on this thing now for the past 2.5 months. Have a big conversation about it with several people coming up on this Saturday. So I know a little bit more than some other folks, but certainly not as much as many others. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Apparently, about 47, something like that, percent of the people in this country are attracted to that concept, I guess. Is that what we can say?
Well, I guess that's if we look at the how many people, according to the polls, are supporting, former President Trump in elections. I guess that's probably accurate if you tie in Project 2025 to his campaign. Sure.
Yeah. Um, so it sounds like to me something has happened. It's not just recent, but over
Yeah.
time, something has happened that has destroyed people's belief in democracy. It, and the people making the decisions, and they're ready to
And,
accept.
and,
They're ready to accept a leader to make these decisions for them, or a group to make these decisions for them. It doesn't sound great. Do we have any other questions, though? Any questions?
I think Nancy does.
Brewster.
Over.
Okay, go ahead. Let's start.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say that David's wrote his podcasts, and it's actually a 10-part series on the master plan that walks through actually how a lot of this has crept up on us, starting with Watergate and coming down to now through the Supreme Court. And it's really, if you're a podcast person, it's worth listening to in the car or when you're walking the dog or washing the dishes. It was really an eye-opener for me, just as much as what you've had to say. It's really astounding.
Right. Thank you. Brewster.
Well, it's, first of all, thank you so much. I just
Can't quite hear you, Brewster.
Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit. Yep.
Oh, geez. I'm sorry. Well, I have an unstable connection, so I'll put it in the chat. Sorry.
No. We can hear you now. We can hear you.
Oh, all right. I'm sorry. I'm outside on a dock here. First of all, I just really appreciate you putting all this together in an organized presentation. I've heard a lot about this whole program in different, but it's in bits and pieces. What's fascinating to me is how fast Trump is trying to distance himself from this agenda, as if he doesn't own it or his own people didn't develop it. And hopefully Harris can nail his ass, continues to nail his ass by basically saying this is the agenda. Understand it because it's devastating to America, right? And that's what he will do if he gets in office. And his job is to say, no, that's not what I'm going to do. I didn't write it. It's not my agenda, but clearly it is. So the more that we can hang it around his neck, so to speak, the better. And one of the things that I think is the most frightening, but hasn't really been fleshed out enough is what does it really mean to have the largest deportation program in the history of the United States? Like, what does that really look like? And so I think we need to, hopefully she will continue to press him on that. So does that mean that people will come door to door and haul people out and put them into paddy wagons and literally haul them off to detention centers in our urban areas, right? And then somehow fly people back to their home country. But what this calls for, if you ask me, is the biggest civil disobedience program that has ever existed in America, where everybody who is opposed to that kind of draconian assault on people who live in the United States right now needs to be like stopped by people sitting in and blocking every effort to enforce that kind of thing. I hope we never have to deal with that. Obviously, it's why we all need to work hard. People understand what is he really talking about, and is that America?
Right. One of the things that we can predict, at different times, unfortunately, our country's history, different people or groups have been targeted because of the policies of administrations. And what we're seeing right now, obviously, are many members of the Latino community are being targeted in different places. And over the past week in our own state, just a few, a few hundred, not even 100, not even 100 miles from here in Springfield, the Haitian community, who are legal immigrants, are being targeted. The community itself is being targeted with bomb threats. And so what will happen, I believe, with this mass deportation and this targeting of individuals, because it's out of fear, is there are certain groups that will literally be targeted by folks in their communities who are not even part of the groups that are intended to be deported. I mean, I just see it happening out of irrational fear and ridiculous things like the accusations that Governor now DeWine is kind of aggressively going after, saying it's not true and we need to be there to support. But a policy saying if you see any folks that you don't think, I mean, let me just say this: when I was a judge in 2016, um, when folks would come in front of us, we had to assess their immigration status. And if they were not legally in the country, we had to give them a disclaimer that basically said, if you're convicted of this offense, you may be deported, or your ability to become a naturalized citizen will be otherwise hampered or obstructed. Trump's policy required the deportation of individuals for minor misdemeanors. And there were certain sheriffs who then asked the judges to ask this or to report anytime somebody didn't speak English who was coming in their courtrooms, so that they could come in and start asking them questions. So what do you have then? If the population knows this, then victims decide they don't want to show up because they're afraid of being targeted. You have individuals, so fewer people report crimes, or if they are reporting crimes, they're afraid to show up to prosecute those crimes, even though they may be victims. You have individuals who are less likely to participate in processes because even though they may have completely legal status, they're concerned about how others are going to look at them and how they may be targeted unnecessarily. So I mean, that becomes more widespread when it's coming down from the top, and when you have people plugged in who are following the will without, a political will of the person who was saying, this is what we're doing, and we're pounding the table with the unreasonable consequences and things like that we're saying, and accusations. So I want you all who work under me to have those same positions and go out here and make sure that you're cleaning up our country. That creates an atmosphere of targeting and racism and hostility and anger and just,
Yeah.
I just fear for what that will create.
Yeah, and then who's going to get targeted next? That's a big concern of mine. But
Right.
You were a judge, I believe, for 3 terms. Is that correct?
Yes, almost. Yep.
Right. And have you reflected at all uh, how perhaps some of the decisions you made as a judge would be affected, could have been affected if something like Project 2025 had been adopted?
Well, as judges, we're supposed to be above the political fray. But then again, so are prosecutors. They're supposed to be, justice is supposed to be the foundation of the individual who's in charge of prosecution. And we know that, with elected prosecutors around the country, that has not necessarily been the case. But what I would be concerned about is, in the same way that they're targeting liberal prosecutors or prosecutors who prosecute or don't prosecute certain offenses, why wouldn't they have that same targeting with judges who they don't feel? And there's a lot of criticism, or they don't put a high enough bond on, or they give too long sentences, or they're trying to, use alternative sentencing. And so then they become targets in the same way. And so as a person who has to make those decisions, you're not supposed to think about that. But in the back of your mind, you're thinking, what is the consequence of each decision that I make each time? And so do I misstep, or do I make a decision that I don't necessarily believe in because I want to make sure that I maintain my position, or so that I'm not made the subject of a news story? Now, for me personally, I didn't worry about that. So I can't think of decisions that I made that would have been affected by that. But a lot of my colleagues were very concerned about appearing in newspapers and how they were being represented and what was being said about them. such that there were a few that I know that the decisions they made, they tested the wind before they made those decisions to make sure that the public was behind them when that was not at all supposed to be what they were supposed to considering when they were making those decisions. So for individual judges, nah, not so much. But as a whole, the concern about that targeting, I can see could impact the decisions that were being made.
So justice could be influenced quite a bit, really, it sounds like, by this.
Absolutely.
What would happen with it.
Well, but also know that as a judge, I only was able to hear the cases that were brought in front of me. And so when the policies of the prosecutors, whether federally or statewide, are on a particular thing or not focused on a particular thing, then those are the cases that are brought, and how they prosecute the cases that are brought have a, go a long way to deciding how the rest of the population moves, makes decisions, interacts with other people. I mean, it all trickles down. So even if the judge themselves, because they only hear certain things, how those policies flow downhill have a huge impact on the day-to-day interactions of citizens.
Right. And then if their decisions change and are affected by the politics, basically, of it all, then that becomes more and more accepted by the public. That's the way it should be. That's the way the law reads.
Right. I think you have a hand up too.
Sue Ellen is trying to talk.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sue.
I'm wondering, this is huge. I have looked at it a little bit. Dan got us a searchable version of it. I've looked at it a little bit for my particular interests, but I'm wondering, in talking with people, if there are certain points that you would want us to bring out in a casual conversation or in a canvassing conversation or something like that, ways to start to make the points succinctly.
That didn't sound sensationalist and scare the shit out of people.
Right. And when I've had those conversations, people say, well, I don't, some of the things that you're presenting about it are scary and crazy. I say, well, I just took a quote from it. I didn't make it up. So if you think it's scary and crazy, then you ought to realize that that's what the document is. I mean, that's the whole point of it. But as far as like a one pager or I don't. I have not put something like that together. I know a few organizations and groups have, because my overall opposition or issue with it, which I don't know how persuasive it would be to the average voter, but it really is about summing up the purpose of this. And that is saying, do you want to acknowledge that we live in a democracy, or do you want to live where the president controls everybody and everything that controls, that has impact on your life? I don't know how to say that in such a way that, those who say, well, I don't really care, don't say I don't care.
Did.
Yeah.
You just did. That was helpful.
But that might be for us. But I mean, but does the average person, do they really believe that's what's in here? And then we say, well, yeah, because they're talking about all of these folks, reporting directly to him, and they're talking about all these people being implanted in every agency who specifically have their goal to implement that person's policies. Like that's what it is. But how do you say that in the one pager and then talk about how crazy all that stuff? I mean, that's the kind of the dilemma. But again, I have not, but I do know that some have. But that's the overriding anti-democracy issue that I don't know why everybody isn't concerned about.
And that's why these camps, there's very little movement in the polls. Now, after the Democratic convention, actually, according to 538 anyway, Kamala started going down a little bit. and now is just starting to come back up where she was, but they're still just polls, and they're very close, within a few percentage points in the races. So a lot of people are ready to accept that. I don't see how anyone could not understand that they're giving control over to basically the leaders of the country if they would vote for Trump. But you know, it's hard for me to understand the MAGA people, the MAGA mind anyway, I think. So yeah, go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, thanks, Fanon, for coming back and giving such a great presentation to us. I picked this up at Democratic headquarters the other day. It's got like 30 sentences about different topics, like increase Arctic drilling, ban Muslims from entering the country, blah, 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 blah. But when you were talking about the founders of the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, and how he said, we don't want everybody to vote. And I mean, they've been doing that for years. I mean, it started out with poll taxes. Now we've got voter suppression. We've got, what ID you can use. We've got, only one drop box, and it's got to be monitored. It's just crazy stuff. But then you get to the second guy, and he said, we don't really want to talk to everybody. We want to talk to the politicians. We want to talk to the staff. And how do you get that? Well, you get that by gerrymandering Ohio, where nobody has to worry about their, getting reelected if you're a Republican. So, all you do is talk to you don't have to talk to the public, they're just, chaff. You don't need to talk to them, but really, thank you for the great presentation.
No, glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do we have any other, Ruth?
First of all, yes, thank you for that amazing compilation.
Thanks.
And well, first, I'm very aware that, to vote yes, I hope the new gerrymandering plan would be well. And I don't know how to make that into a letter to the editor, but I'm going to think about it. And here's what I'm thinking. If I could, I get people to help me do a letter to the editor, but I'm concerned about Social Security. Is there anything specific that you can think of that's in in this document that says, I thought you mentioned it, but is there a little bit more I could put into a sentence that us old people would be really concerned?
Well, no, what they do is they talk about Medicaid. Agenda 47, surprisingly, says they're going to fight for and protect Social Security and Medicare with no cuts, including no change to the retirement age.
Okay,
Yeah. So, no, Project 2025, what I found about Medicaid is that they're going to reduce funding. They're going to cut funding significantly to Medicaid. And also, they're going to have a work requirement in order to qualify, like they did with welfare, which, the welfare work requirement was pretty tough when it came in. I mean, it may be an argument for it, but that came in under Clinton. That was one of the, policies that was consistent with project, I guess it was 1990 or whatever it was, 1988, that he felt was helpful. But with Medicaid, no, they intend to cut Medicaid and impose a work requirement in order to be eligible for Medicaid. You're welcome.
Very good. Any other questions tonight? Okay, Fanon, thank you very much.
Thank you
for coming and meeting with us. I know you
course.
put a lot of work into studying Project 2025 and really appreciate your sharing the information with us. So, tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You all be safe. I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very, very much.
Take care.
Good evening.